Russian federal TV channels have refused to give a detailed account of why mass protests and bloody riots broke out in Nepal. The main reason is the blocking of 26 social networks by the country's authorities, including Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube, X, and LinkedIn, writes Agents Info. The local youth immediately revolted and overthrew the government, a nightmare for the Putin regime. The fact is that in recent years, no fewer restrictions have been introduced in Russia, but Russians tolerate it. A vivid example of the overthrow of a dictatorship with a video of a triumphant crowd causes concern in the Kremlin, so the coverage of the protests on Kremlin channels was appropriate. Russian TV either kept silent about this detail or passed it over in passing. Instead, the version about intervention by external forces was routinely aired. Russia 1 did not say a word about blocking social networks. Channel 1 mentioned the ban only in passing, emphasizing the external coincidence of the protests with Nepal's intention to join the SCO. NTV, although it named the blocking of foreign platforms as the reason for the protests, did not list which social networks were banned. Experts emphasize that the reality was different. Nepal's youth took to the streets precisely because the authorities banned their usual channels of communication and information. The protests turned into mass riots. Dozens of people died. The parliament, the Supreme Court, and the houses of officials were burned. Under pressure from the streets, the government lifted the ban, and the country's prime minister resigned. For the Kremlin and Russian propagandists, this is a scary scenario. In Russia, Facebook, Instagram, X, LinkedIn are also banned. YouTube is restricted and WhatsApp calls are blocked. But there were no protests in the country, which is why federal channels are trying to shift attention to external interference, just so that Russians do not draw parallels and think that the government is afraid. People are capable of overthrowing the government if it deprives them of basic freedoms. For many, the scenes in Kathmandu were reminiscent of the turmoil that gripped Bangladesh last year and Sri Lanka in 2022. The unrest began Monday as a self-styled Gen Z protest against corruption, nepotism, and restrictions on social media. It quickly escalated after security forces opened fire on the crowds. Then protesters had stormed and torched Parliament, the Supreme Court, and multiple government offices, including Singha Durbar, the central administrative complex. Homes of political leaders were attacked, police stations overrun, and Tribhuvan International Airport briefly closed. In addition, media outlets and schools were set on fire, while the Ministry of Health and Population was also destroyed, including the National Health Emergency Operations Center. The army assumed control of nationwide security late Tuesday, local time, deploying troops across the Kathmandu Valley and imposing movement restrictions to stabilise the situation. Checkpoints were established and people have been urged to stay home except for essential travel. Media also reported the army recovering some of the weapons looted from police personnel, while youth groups helped apprehend escaped prisoners and return firearms. Some inmates voluntarily surrendered.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and his Finnish counterpart Alexander Stubb laid wreaths in memory of the fallen soldiers on Thursday at a memorial in Kiev's St. Michael's Cathedral. With gratitude and respect, we cherish the memory of every fallen warrior. Eternal and bright memory to all who gave their lives defending our independence and our people, Zelensky wrote on Telegram, according to Associated Press.
On September the 8th, 2025, the first Deputy Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and Chief of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov turned 70, which is formally the age limit for senior officers of the Russian army and a reason for resignation. Russian media asks who could become his successor and what could this change in the current strategy used in the SVO zone. Before the start of the operation in Ukraine, the figure of Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov, known in narrow circles as Shoigu's man, did not attract such increased attention. He found himself in his post back in 2012 and has held it longer than any of his predecessors in the post-Soviet era. Valery Gerasimov found himself in the spotlight after the start of the SVO, which clearly did not go according to the original plan, whatever it was. But after the withdrawal of Russian troops from the north and northeast of Ukraine, and then from the right bank of the Dnieper, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces, along with his boss Shoigu, found themselves the objects of harsh criticism from the patriotic public of Russia. The former Minister of Defense of the DPR, Igor Girkin-Strelkov, and the top manager of the Wagner PMC, Yevgeny Prigozhin, were the ones who made the most of this simple public appearance. The former ended up behind bars on an extremism case where he remains to this day, and the latter died, along with the commander-in-chief of his private army, Dmitry Utkin, in a plane crash exactly 2 months after his so-called March of Justice, which took place on June the 23rd to the 24th, 2023. But the army tandem Shoigu-Gerasimov did not last much longer. Sergei Shoigu resigned from his post on May the 12th, 2024, and Andrei Belousov took his place. After that, major purges began in the Ministry of Defense, as a result of which a number of high-ranking officers of the Russian army ended up behind bars on charges of bribery, corruption and fraud. The name of Deputy Minister Timur Ivanov has already become somewhat of a household word. The following assumptions are being made about the future of Chief of the General Staff, Gerasimov himself. Having received the Order of Courage for his 70th birthday, he may retire from military service with honor. It is possible that he may even take up another high-ranking position like his former boss, Sergei Shoigu, who was promoted to become the head of the Security Council of the Russian Federation. 49-year-old Colonel General Andrei Mordvichev is named as a possible successor to Gerasimov as Chief of the General Staff. The former commander of the Central Military District and the Center Group of Forces in the Northeastern Military District, which became famous for liberating the long-suffering Avdiivka, was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the Ground Forces in May 2025. According to some reports, Mordvichev has been the first Deputy Chief of the General Staff for several days now, and it is with this event that the large-scale transfer of Russian troops to the DPR from other directions is associated. We will discuss in more detail below how the nature of military operations in Donbass may change under his direct leadership.